Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Adversary Universe podcast, and today's going to be a subtly different approach to what we're talking about. There was a time when cybersecurity policy lived in the basement of the White House, somewhere between miscellaneous, and we'll deal with that budget meeting later on, but not anymore. Now we've got 6 pillars, we've got this strategic reset, and the federal government is basically saying cyber is no longer an IT problem, it's a national survival sport, and this is a new strategy that's so important to us that today we're breaking this down with none other than Robert Sheldon, Director of Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike. Welcome to the show, Rob. How's it going?
Thanks for having me, buddy. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
All right, let's do this. I heard we're gonna get into the 6 pillars, but I would love for you to maybe give the listeners a little background on, your journey here at CrowdStrike, some of your background, and then why this is so important and why everyone should be very aware of these pillars.
Yeah. So Adam frequently asks me the question because it's because I'm out all the time meeting with our stakeholders in government and in policy circles. So CrowdStrike has at this point pretty mature and sophisticated team of people that go out and we interface with government around public policy topics that are either of interest to them organically because they've sought out views from industry or other people that are in a position to know, or because we've decided that we need to flag something that we've seen that's important for them to consider in a lawmaking process or a regulatory process. So that's what my team's up to here at CrowdStrike. Been at the company for 9 years doing some version of that. And previously I have worked in government and in think tanks and foundations and things, always on cybersecurity issues.
Wow, I can't believe it's been 9 years.
Yeah, I know. That's amazing.
It was like just yesterday. Yeah. Time flies.
Yeah.
Time does fly.
All right, so for the listeners, explain what's going on. We're going to do some air horns. I think this deserves some, we're going to go 6 pillars. 6 pillars. Lots of echo. Hopefully the producers can help with that. But let's cover the 6 pillars and why that's important. And then I think we're going to, in the interest of time, only cover 3 today. But let's give a little background on what actually started the 6 pillar or this strategy at the White House.
Sure. So typically in every administration, the folks working on cybersecurity issues, and at this point, really that exists at the White House, is the lead for public policy issues that impact not just the U.S. government, but also critical infrastructure and cybersecurity issues that impact the broader economy. Really, that's led from a policy standpoint at the White House Office of the National Cyber Director, presently Director Sean Caron-Cross and his staff. And typically an administration will come in and they will work on a national security strategy, the Defense Department will work on a defense strategy, and you have other agencies that produce strategies. And at this point, there is a longstanding tradition of having a cybersecurity strategy. So that's what we're talking about today. We have an expectation that the White House will release their version of the national cyber strategy imminently, perhaps this week. Although there's a lot going on geopolitically, so sometimes that can push out a couple days or a couple weeks. But in any event, because we've had a lot of consultations and conversations with stakeholders that have been involved in the process, we have an idea about what's going to be covered in the document. And as you mentioned, there are 6 pillars. So would love to make this a 2-hour podcast, as you all know. But we can,
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate a 2-hour podcast
on policy. Yeah.
Maybe break down just at a high level, what are the 6 pillars?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Right. So the 6 pillars. The first is deterring adversaries through more offensive cyber operations. That's really taking a more proactive approach to confronting adversaries so that we're not just waiting passively for them to attack us. The second is streamlining regulations, because at this point, there's been a lot of regulations that have been promulgated, and there's some confusion often in the private sector, especially with small and medium-sized businesses, about what they need to report or what regulations might pertain precisely to them. So there's an initiative always to streamline those and make it clearer for everybody. The third is modernizing federal IT networks, because there's so many constraints about what new technologies those sorts of organizations can acquire. And often there's resource constraints, so they may not be able to refresh the technology at the rate that their commercial counterparts might. So there's a need to sort of drive more adoption of newer technologies. The fourth is securing critical infrastructure. Really, this is an ongoing, decades-long project in the United States. So much commercial infrastructure is owned by the private sector. There's obviously governmental interest in making sure that it's up to date and resilient to attacks. But often these are owned by utilities and other organizations that don't have a lot of resources. And from a geopolitical perspective, they're extremely highly targeted. So there's always a need to try and tighten those controls and make sure that their posture can really withstand any sort of geopolitical conflict and attacks that might land on them, essentially, or target them if there is heightened risk.
So is that regulation? Is that how you do that?
Yeah, there's always this tension in the policy discourse around securing critical infrastructure about what's likely to get to the best outcome. Is that more about applying regulations? Is it more about sharing information so that there's just more awareness, or is it about potentially providing resources so that organizations at this point might well know that they're highly targeted and they just don't have the resources to do anything about it? So there's kind of a conversation about like, well, what if we could resource these organizations better?
I know we'll talk about this later, but it sounds like there's going to be more oversight on the supply chain side, right? If we're talking about a major upgrade on infrastructure, especially if there's a supply chain concern right now, right? On where all this gear is coming from. So
is that its own pillar?
Exactly right. No, that's part of the overall approach to critical infrastructure is, like Cristian mentioned, being attentive to where is this technology, where the products come from that service these networks. Often because of the constrained budgets that they have, they've gone for low cost options. Obviously, there's Chinese equipment in the supply chain, and that creates a different risk surface or attack surface potentially, along geopolitical lines.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. The fifth pillar is making sure that the U.S. is postured to adopt the most advanced emerging technologies. So it's making sure that AI is being used, where we can from a national competitiveness standpoint, and just making sure that we're resistant to quantum developments and things like that. So just making sure that we're at the leading edge from a commercial technology standpoint. And then the sixth is building this sort of business-driven cyber workforce that is, that is ready to confront all the cyber threats that are frankly proliferating very quickly, and to make sure that there's a workforce in the country that's available for critical infrastructure defense purposes, for commercial defense purposes, and also so the government has the ability to hire and employ proficient cybersecurity operators. So those are the 6 pillars.
So it's kind of leading by offense. It's taking a look at cleaning up some of the existing policies and regulations. It's, what was the third one? Or was that the third one?
It's modernizing federal.
Modernizing federal IT. Okay. Yeah. Critical infrastructure. Just recounting this for everybody here. Right? Yeah. I think we're gonna have to memorize these. So, and then
there will be a test.
Yeah. And then it sounds like workforce and technology enablement are the last 2.
That's right.
Well, that sounds like 6 really important and reasonable things for us to be focused on.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah.
What's your favorite?
That's a great question. What is your favorite?
Well, the one that, Adam, I could predict your favorite because of your longstanding advocacy for taking a more proactive approach to defeating cyber threats. I'm of like mind, obviously. Offense. Exactly right. I'm of the same mind, of course. Although I spend a lot of my time and have spent a lot of my time over the years focused on federal cybersecurity. So I have a strong affinity to that sort of mission set. So Pillar 3 is one that I spend a lot of time looking at.
Yeah, and I think there is just such a mosaic of different rules and regulations out there that kind of streamlining that makes a lot of sense. Investing in, I'd be interested to know kind of from investing in the IT tools and products and services that the government uses, how much legacy stuff are they kind of stuck on? Like how many mainframes are out there and things that just can't be easily replaced, or you wouldn't necessarily want to even replace in some of those contexts?
Yeah, it's such a good point. Different agencies have a different burden from the standpoint of legacy infrastructure. Of course, there's quite a bit out there across different functions, and a lot of it is load-bearing in that it's still being used. So the bright side is that there are some agencies that have been able to, over time, adopt newer technologies. So relative to say 5 years ago, even there's a lot more cloud technologies being used. There's a lot more organizations that look from like an infrastructure standpoint more comparable to large enterprises in the private sector, and that they're using mobile, they're using SaaS applications, they have some of the identity technologies in place that their commercial counterparts might. But often, in addition to having some of those sorts of technologies, they will still have some of that those critical systems that are essentially legacy. And then in some instances, there's organizations out there that they have the leadership in place, they know where it is that they need to go, but because of slow procurement cycles or budgetary constraints, they haven't quite been able to get there yet. So it's really fair to say that a lot of these organizations are in the midst of change, and they really need technologies and solutions that can help them cover areas that they know are at risk, and do it in a way that's coherent and adaptable, so that as they are able to integrate these new technologies, they can do so flexibly and in a way that means they don't have to redesign their security program from scratch.
But also, we don't want open cloud running our strategic missiles.
That's right. There are some practical constraints on getting the up to the minute latest technologies in some of these critical institutions. But the people that are in charge, often the federal agency CISOs, the federal agency CIOs, they're aware of their constraints, and they want to be proactive. They want to lean into technologies that are validated and sort of seen as leading edge, but they may not be issuing Mac Minis and OpenClaw instances to all their employees at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the offense one is definitely interesting, and we could probably have a whole discussion, a whole pod around that. But I think the most problematic is the critical infrastructure one, because they don't own the critical infrastructure, and there's having worked across the space for a while now, there's some mom and pops out there that, or two guys and a dog, as some people like to say, that they are responsible for something absolutely essential from a ICS or SCADA perspective to a gas pipeline or something like that, and it's kind of like a small shop that does it, and they just don't have the resources or the subject matter expertise to do it. Yeah. So I think that's probably one of the most fundamental and daunting challenges, is going to be that critical infrastructure pillar.
That's right. This has been something that's, I think, confounded a lot of policymakers for a long period of time, because there's a sense that we need to do more to confront the threats against that sector. But again, because some of them are utilities or have other sort of pricing constraints in place, they don't necessarily have the means to bring in some of the new technologies. I think that as an industry, we're at a point now where I think we've done a pretty successful job at awareness. We've raised the concerns, and the issue at this point is more about resourcing. So, whereas 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you were talking to critical infrastructure operators, they genuinely might not have known that they've been in the crosshairs. These days, when you talk to people in the industry, they get it, but there's still that constraint of okay, well, there's some expense to refreshing our technology or to adopting the latest systems. And from a government standpoint, there's some, I think, in both the executive branch and the legislative branch, they recognize that you can't just regulate an outcome there. You can't just say, thou shalt have the best technologies. There is some need to sort of balance, providing them guidance, providing them, mechanisms and tools to be able to share information and whatnot. But ultimately, this may run into a resourcing challenge. So it's incumbent upon all of us that work in policy circles to really try and, help come up with ways and techniques that they can use to advance the goal of better cybersecurity there, recognizing the constraints that are in place. So I'm looking forward to that, to reading the final national cybersecurity strategy pillar on this, and then I expect that there's going to be some follow-on policies. Having talked with the Office of the National Cyber Director, they're aware of some of these constraints, and I expect that they'll have some techniques. They'll have some policies in place that they want to use to advance, their concept of what the next most logical few steps are to increase cybersecurity there.
And this is probably, I don't know if this is under the executive branch or not, but there probably needs to be some sort of funding or financial relief for those organizations to incentivize them to invest in cybersecurity. And I think every time, policy and things at CrowdStrike is a team sport. So when I've testified before, usually it's Rob kind of helping build that the testimony and taking what I want to say and make it palatable to normal people. And so, he waters it down a little bit, but, I always, he's always adding things around kind of how are we going to fund some of these changes. And I think that is going to be the devil for the details. There is how are these guys going to fund some of these changes?
Yeah,
Rob,
that's
Rob,
right,
can I
Adam.
ask a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
I do want to ask a question because I think that some of these pillars are very dependent, or the impact that you have across these pillars, right? I think if you push one, the other one's going to hit the other, and you'll kind of have this domino effect. But for example, number one, deterring adversaries through offensive cyber operations, like, really is interesting to me. In fact, I remember 11 years when I started, people would ask me, like, oh, is CrowdStrike a hackback company? Because it sounds like that, and I had to explain that we're not. However, it sounds like federally, if we start to create this offensive program, how does a retaliation campaign impact us if we have so much infrastructure that's out there that is susceptible to, these, exploitation, or, we have a lack of resources to support even new technology, right? Like, is the administration currently weighing the impact of creating an offensive program and what that would look like, on the off?
I think they have offensive programs, right? Like, I think it's important to note that there's only really two mechanisms, and Rob, chime in if I'm wrong here, but the two mechanisms I'm aware of for conducting offensive operations are Title 10 and Title 50. And that is not something that is extended beyond the Department of War and the intelligence community and the law enforcement communities. So that's something that I think that first pillar is strong, like heavily indexed on the government owning it and driving it, and there's really not much for other people, to get involved in at this point with that, unless they've changed something, Rob.
No, it's a great point, Adam. So there's all sorts of, like, ongoing activities, and there's obviously the government has governmental functions and capabilities that they can bring to bear. I think, Cristian, to your point, if this were a really easy problem to solve, it would have been solved before. There's a lot of attention that's been spent over time from previous administrations on how do we make sure that we're confronting some of this threat activity, and it's just a challenging problem. So I think that the NCD in this case is really trying to think about balancing not just the governmental functions that exist, and really improving those where that's possible, maybe to streamline them, to make them more effective. Maybe to do them more persistently where that's called for, and coherent with administration policy given the sort of broader geopolitical context.
Sure.
But I also think that they want to bring the private sector to bear a little bit more on this problem. And by that I mean they want to make sure that where there's an opportunity for industry to do things like disruptions and takedowns of threat actor groups or their infrastructure, that industry is doing that, and that they're doing it in a way which is effectual based on cooperation with other stakeholders in the community, and is not gated by any particular function in government, but is done in a way which is sort of coordinated. And really, there is an opportunity to improve how this works. There are a few different organizations in government whose mission it is to facilitate those sort of things. There's JCDC at Homeland Security. There's comparable programs at NSA C3 and with Cyber Command. And I think that part of the challenge for the administration is to say, how do we make those sorts of programs and sort of spiritually similar programs much more effective, so that if you are a small business or if you're a critical infrastructure operator, you're not just waiting for the next attack, but that there are efforts in place upstream to defend you before a threat actor even is able to try and target you.
It would be interesting to see if that extends, beyond nation state to cybercrime, because I think one of the biggest challenges we've seen, I don't anticipate us using an offensive action that's going to be disruptive against espionage necessarily. I think with espionage, you introduce friction, you make it more difficult for the threat actor to get access to what they want. You make the data kind of, if you can disrupt the data mid-flow and then they end up with something that can't unpack or can't decrypt or something like that, that's super useful. But I think, when you take a look at critical infrastructure, you look at some of the existential threats, and look, it may be genuine e-crime, or it may be a threat actor like Voodoo Bear, which we've seen take on a persona of e-crime, right, with things like what was the NotPetya and stuff like that. So at some point, I think there is an opportunity to take the fight to those e-criminals from a national security perspective.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There have been efforts led by the FBI or that the FBI has participated in that have targeted some of those sorts of groups. Obviously, Adam, you and your team have facilitated some of our support to takedowns of things like botnets over time. I think that the question the community is asking itself, and really this is being driven by the White House right now, which is just like, okay, that happens at some interval organically. How do we make sure that we're if we're doing a takedown of a threat actor infrastructure or e-criminal infrastructure once every month or once every quarter or something like that, how do we get to a place where we've goosed that process so that we're doing it every month, every week, twice a week, and really sort of achieving a new stasis so that none of these criminals can get super comfortable. Obviously, over time, there's been scenarios where people have used, if you go back 10 years, you read these threat intel reports and or Adam, in your case, write them. Just like, okay, we have this sort of infrastructure that's been out for it's been around for 6 years and there's 150 victims. That's allowed the threat actors to achieve scale in their operations. The charge for us as a community now is how do we cooperate with different service providers or different vendors or different entities that have visibility into this sort of thing. It pops up, one victim's attacked, and then we tear it down. They have to go back and start all over again. Obviously, with us introducing friction with with maybe stopping payments or stopping their ability to monetize it as well.
Well, I think that there's a great example of that in the last year, right? We saw the BitLocker disruption, for example. In 2024, Bitwise Spider was one of the top ransomware actors. There was disruptions. They are effectively suppressed at this point, let's say. And everybody took a step back and was looking at, oh, great, like we did this thing, like we've disrupted something. And while they're doing that, Punk Spider steps up. And in the global threat report that we released recently, we noted that there was 198 instances of Punk Spider ransom attacks, and it was a 134% increase year over year. So when you take one down, somebody else is going to come step up and get that money. And unless you keep that constant pressure on those threats, they're going to have time to regroup, and you could disrupt. It's kind of like saying you disrupted the cloud provider, right? So sure. If you take out one cloud provider and all of their customers move to another cloud provider, they're still operating, right? And it's the same thing with ransomware as a service. If you disrupt BitLocker, there's still all of these different affiliates that are using that platform to do ransomware attacks. You didn't disrupt them; you just forced them to switch platforms.
Yeah. I'm really curious if like Operation Endgame was a major influence, like the success of that operation, if it's really driving this first pillar now. So I'm really curious.
Well, I think Endgame was more out of Europe, though. I think that this is something that has
even just
been,
the success of it, right? Just the
I think it's
collaboration
been
with private
coming
sector
for a while.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this for almost as long as CrowdStrike's been around.
Really?
The need for the government to keep the pressure on from an offensive perspective, and I think. The reality is that stuff, if it's done in the context of law enforcement, it needs somebody from not just law enforcement, but you need somebody from Department of Justice. You need a prosecutor. You need a case. You need a reason to do the disruption. They can't just be like, here's a good idea, let's do this. So because there's all of these constraints on what you need to do to plan an operation and execute it, I think that's what puts a lot of the friction into that process. So if the first pillar really looks at removing some of that friction, and I think that's within the executive branch's remit, right, to remove some of the friction for DOJ to authorize activity, and look, we're going to get it wrong too, and I think that's another big concern, because you could have 10 successes offensively disrupting a threat actor, but if you have one negative consequence because of an offensive operation, it's going to take years to walk that back and to get everybody comfortable again. So there's kind of, there's a lot of tensions on this particular issue.
That's right. I think those tensions over time have led to the status quo that we exist in now, which is that every once in a while you'll see one of these operations come through and they'll be successful, and obviously a ton of hard work and dedication goes into it. I think the point of pillar number one is really to say we need to stop being so small c conservative about this, and we need to be more more persistent and more effective. And I don't think anybody in the White House, when they say that, is saying we should be reckless about it. I think there's still very much a norm for practitioners in this space to want to measure twice and cut once. But it's just a reflection on the status quo not being tolerable right now. We can't sort of mosey along and do these things. We need to really increase the rate and tempo.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to think about some of the things historically, like there was I forgot what it was, but there was a DNS botnet takedown years and years ago where they actually removed the bot from the victim machines, but they could only do it if the victim machine was checking in from the US or one of the other countries' participating territory. And so when you're doing, particularly with a botnet disruption, it's really important that you take it out completely. And we've seen, and we've talked about this before, when you do a disruption and you don't do a thorough disruption, the threat actor can wrestle control back. And we saw that with Kelios probably a dozen times, where the Kelios botnet was disrupted. CrowdStrike disrupted it live on stage at RSA one year. Right. And it was back up and running that afternoon because the threat actor hadn't been taken out of the equation. When it was finally fully disrupted, they arrested Peter Levashov in Spain at the same time that the botnet was disrupted, so nobody else in his organization could maintain control of it. And so that kind of 1-2 punch removed Kelios from the playing field forever. And that is the kind of operational planning that needs to go on with these things. And I think the number one issue is do no harm. So like we could do a lot more to impact some of these threats, but it gets into, I think, a whole legal discussion, and I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination. And the issue is like, okay, like if you are going to do this, you're breaking 7 different laws, right? This is a violation of CFAA and all of these other things. We're trying to do the right thing, right? And that's a conversation even law enforcement might have with DOJ. Like, you guys can't do this. You're breaking this is Fourth Amendment or something like that, So there's so many legal challenges and hurdles to this stuff that makes it a really hard problem.
Yeah, I think that's definitely impacted the rate of these sorts of activities over time. The episode that you all recorded a few weeks back with Sean Henry talking about the importance of coordinating these sorts of things with law enforcement is such an important point. Listeners have to absolutely go back and check that out if they missed it. It's so true. And it's one of the reasons why, we in industry, obviously Adam, through your team, we have all sorts of contacts with our counterparts and peers at other entities, whether they're cybersecurity companies or telecom providers or some of the big platforms. But it's not the thing for all the reasons that you mentioned, or it's not the type of thing that we'd want to just go out and do by ourselves. And then, in passing, if we see someone in government at a conference say like, hey, guess what? We just did X, Y, and Z thing. You might have seen about it. There really is a role for government to convene.
You might have seen our massive press release and marketing push about
it. you may have seen the tweets. But yes. So there's really a role for government to sort of convene the people that have relevant insights or authorities or sort of a coordinating function in terms of bringing that sort of maybe added law enforcement perspective to bear, and then making sure that everybody's comfortable and moving forward. But there's a need to be able to do that, and then to do that really along multiple different tracks, so that there's, it's not the case that the whole community is absorbed by just one of these sorts of disruptions or operations. Hopefully we can get to the point where we can do multiple of these things over time, and thereby really reduce the instances of some of these broad campaigns that have reached scale that impact dozens or scores or hundreds of different victims globally. Because again, that's something that the current NCD and the White House look at as intolerable.
You always hear about cyber Pearl Harbor and the kind of threat of some sort of an attack. We almost need like a Cyber Manhattan project where we get all of the top kind of offensive people together and lock them up in the desert or something like that, and say, hey, like here's a series of hard problems and targets that we want to go after. Let's solve that.
Okay, let's talk about Pillar 3. And I don't think we have time to again cover every single one of these, but Adam, you made some really interesting points on what it's going to take to modernize, or really the definition of modernizing, federal IT networks. And I know there's a lot of like frameworks being pushed out there, like CMMC, and Zero Trust has become a very relevant topic in the Fed space over the past 4 to 5 years. It's active in every conversation I've had, that can be directly impacting federal and public sector or even adjacent to it. But how do you see that evolving, right? Because again, I know that budgets are always an issue, but there's a lot of older technologies being used. I think that there's a lack of federal agencies embracing newer technologies because of restrictions around even things like FedRAMP or policy or certifications that are required to get more modern technology into the current stack that's out there. So what does that look like, and how does that impact that evolution?
Now let me add a second question to that, and then we could just pull the string on Rob and let him go. But the other thing is that it's one thing at the federal government. I think the federal government actually has pretty good history with doing cybersecurity. They could always be done better, but the thing that I would kind of call attention to is that the federal government still has incredible interaction with state and local governments, tribal.
Exactly.
It has overlap with NGOs and INGOs and universities and academia. So it's not one standalone thing.
Sure.
They need to be able to not just do cybersecurity well at the federal level, but they need to cascade that down to all of the other
all
components.
Public sector. And all the adjacent agencies. Yeah, exactly. Agreed.
Yes, there's a really interesting paradox here, in my view, where the federal government, notwithstanding that they do have some resource constraints, definitely has more resources available to it than the average state government or the average municipal government. But there's also, over time, been a lot more restrictions on how they can do acquisitions and how many steps and checks they must go through before they, for example, deprecate a technology that's no longer working or procure technology that's validated by industry counterparts or peers as sort of leading edge. So the paradox here is that really, if you go back 5 and 10 years ago, you started to see state and local entities really at the leading edge of acquiring technologies like endpoint detection and response and being able to use cloud-based security technologies and really sort of managed security service provider type arrangements or architectures so that they can protect the various federated entities. And you saw that adoption in that space more quickly than you saw it in the federal space. So in a sense, there was a resource paradox here, where where like the fact of some of the constraints, but the absence of some of the policy or program constraints in the state and local government meant that they could work with a CrowdStrike, for example, where the federal government was still kind of pinned based on some of these legacy strictures. And over the past 5 years, in particular, there's been a lot of really positive developments on the federal side as well, where I think they looked at industry and they looked at even some of the state and local peers and said, wow, it's intolerable that they have, at this point, a better security posture than we're able to have. And you've seen the integration of cloud technologies, endpoint detection and response, and some of the sort of IT security and patching and other technologies that you can get when you have a modern sort of approach to endpoint and a modern SOC. So there's been a ton of really positive developments there. There's still so much work to do because of the legacy technology problem that we talked about a few moments ago, but they're better off now than they were. The next sort of frontier, and I'd love to have Adam talk about this a little bit too, is just if there's a sense that the federal government is catching up relative to where they were 5 years ago with some of the industry counterparts, it's important to recognize that people in industry are absolutely going mad right now, trying to meet and confront the sort of opportunities and challenges from AI. So it'd probably be useful for us to spend just a moment talking about how once you have a sort of relatively modern approach to endpoint, what are the imperatives that you have to focus on for maybe next gen SIEM or AI security technologies? Because really this is the problem that people in government are going to need to confront over the coming year and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is probably the most important and pressing concern for everybody. And identity is tied to so many other things, right? Cloud, AI authenticates through the identity layer. So I think identity is probably one of the top things that organizations really need to look at. When we look at the Global Threat Report, for example, we saw a 37% increase in cloud attacks, and in 35% of those, it was using valid credentials. Mm-hmm. And that 37% increase sounds not necessarily catastrophic, but keep in mind that we saw a 266% increase in nation states targeting the cloud. So this problem over the course of the next year becomes worse, and it lands squarely in federal systems if they don't have identity sorted out.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Just to kind of go back to the kind of the intricate, interconnectedness of everything, you could have the most secure federal government, right? You could think like, I don't know, Alabama, Missile Defense Agency's got a bunch of stuff down there. They could have everything completely dialed in, but they're pulling power from the local grid. They're pulling water. They're pulling gas. They're still tied to the state and local government infrastructure. And if they don't do it right, there's very few things you could do on that base if you don't have power, water, and gas.
Yeah, that's right. From a military readiness standpoint, there's been all this concern around actors like Operator Panda, Vanguard Panda, about being able to do intelligence operations and intelligence operations in support of prepositioning, essentially. And we have a sense, defenders in the community, that if there's a certain style of geopolitical conflict, that certainly those enabling infrastructures, water, power, and telecom will be disrupted to impact the military's ability to be able to respond to a conflict. So I think there's more appreciation for that now. There's certainly been a lot of attention from people in CISA, people in the military and defense space, and the intelligence community, as well as the White House, on making sure that we're confronting those threats. But this is clearly a scenario where across the U.S. economy, like sort of the tide, rising tide raises all boats. And the more ready that our critical infrastructures, even our small and local businesses, our agricultural entities, really far-flung different parts of the economy, the better their security posture, the more able we'll be to sort of confront some of these conflicts if it comes to pass. And in the meantime, we get the ancillary benefit of protecting some of these types of entities from e-crime, which is obviously heavily targeting them all the time.
Yeah. I think that's a really good segue then into the last pillar we'll cover on this episode, but it is actually then securing that critical infrastructure and phasing out some of the Chinese technology that we've been seeing. And I think a lot of this also even pivots into the global threat report that we just published. So Adam, I know in the report we highlight the increase in activity coming out of China, in particular the perimeter targeting that we've been seeing, right? So exploiting systems within a couple of days of a disclosure of a CVE, a lot of zero-day usage against perimeter devices, edge devices. And so what does that mean now in terms of the upgrade process, right? If we're doing a full reassessment of, what is the hardware, what is the gear tied to this critical infrastructure that can be targeted and has been targeted? Because that could be a major mandate now, right? Where we're phasing that technology out.
This is an extensive problem. China's been building this capability since they started changing the national security law back in 2017, 2018, and that effectively centralized their exploit vulnerability development. We mentioned in the global threat report that they're effective at getting an exploit out of a new vulnerability within 2 days of its disclosure. And just recently, CISA put out the warning around the SD-WAN stuff on some of the Cisco devices. And there is so much legacy black box hardware across the internet and certainly across the federal government that it is a patching problem. It is a visibility problem. And if you don't have visibility, and this is a very controversial thing that I say to people, I don't care about a 0 day. You could show up with a 0 day as every day of the week. And the reality is we're probably going to be looking at that pretty soon because with AI, it's really good at finding vulnerabilities and building exploits for those vulnerabilities. So I think in the 3 to 9 months coming, we're staring down the barrel of an epidemic of 0 days. Now, when a 0 day gets used, you still need to do something else, right? Just because they open the door doesn't mean that they get what they want. They still have to go into the building and look around and pick things up and touch that. And what is important to note is that you can find that with threat hunting. You can find that if you have instrumentation and visibility. So you pick any network device that you're concerned about. One of the things that I think is a pretty cool story, a year ago or so was when Operator Panda Salt Typhoon first hit the news. Everybody freaked out. We freaked out because we had no visibility into the devices that were being targeted. It was all Cisco and Citrix and Fortinet and Palo and stuff like that. And so I reached out to Corey and said, hey, we don't have any of this visibility. That makes me real uncomfortable. What can we do? And he went out and I think he hit like Craigslist or something and bought all the gear he could, stacked it, racked it, and got it set up the way he wanted to, and then figured out how to instrument it into our next-gen SIM so that the Overwatch threat hunting team now has 48 different patterns that they can hunt on in Cisco telemetry that we've instrumented in Next Gen SIEM to look for operator Panda.
Love that.
And that's the type of thing that the government really is going to need to look at. Is you can have the most modern operating system in the world. That's easy to update, right? You push that out and you've got the latest and greatest. I did it this morning and you did it this morning to all of our devices. So it's not that hard of a challenge, I think, on the endpoint. It becomes much harder when you have this incredibly vast ecosystem of products, different versions, different implementations. You don't want to just roll out patches necessarily, without having some sort of testing in place. And so that gets to prioritization frameworks. And then it's like, well, how are we prioritizing what we're patching? And at the end of the day, there's so many devices out there that go unpatched and unfixed. I'll tell you a quick story. I used to do red teaming. I was a pen tester in the federal space, and I was working for a federal agency, and I was doing a pen test, and I tried to drop a web shell on this server that I found a vulnerability in, and I couldn't write the web shell to disk. And I was like, what is going on? I started looking around. I had popped that box previously with the same web shell, and they not only didn't patch it, they didn't remove the web shell, right? So funny. And this is years and years ago, but it gives you a sense of like what kind of, debt we have in terms of patching and maintenance. And that is, I think, the thing that is really unnerving and why it's so important to get that visibility. I'm going to land this plane, get that visibility into those network devices so that you can actually hunt on it and know what's going on.
We should also say that really the imperative here is to gain visibility everywhere. This is when people will ask me like, what would Adam say about this, or what would Adam say about that? Really, it's just like
I'd love to hear your impression.
Yeah, it's like, well, let me see that. Let me see that. In reference to all these like edge devices, the legacy infrastructure, the network infrastructure, and they're really bringing our threat hunting capability to that. Because to your point, Adam, some of these devices, they don't support having a normal endpoint agent on it, so therefore they've missed the revolution that the rest of the enterprise has undergone, where we've been able to instrument everything, we've been able to hunt across the data. So bringing that visibility into the sort of dark corners of the network, being able to bring the Overwatch team and really threat hunting to those devices is the thing that will prevent some of these attacks from really causing the devastating outcomes that we're all fearful of. And that's kind of the next task. Really, as an industry, we've been pretty successful at being able to elevate the security posture of your general enterprise. It took a long time, a lot of acrimony to get there. But if you are if you're like a laptop, a desktop, a server at this point, if you're in the fleet of an enterprise that has fairly modern technologies, you're pretty well defended. And that's why threat actors, as we all know, go to some of these edge devices and have targeted them. So we need to bring the same sort of perspective and visibility into those places that we have elsewhere in the enterprise. And being able to bring threat hunting there in particular is a thing that will identify some of these things that might be a zero-day attack, or they might be very sophisticated or very, very novel approaches, like we've seen from the Vanguard Pandas and the Operator Pandas of the world.
And here's the terrifying thing, if I can leave you with something. We created this problem on these edge devices, on these network appliances and things like that. We're building the same problem right now with AI. AI is hyper competitive. All of these frontier models and capabilities are being built to outcompete with each other, but they're not building in the logging and the visibility that's needed to instrument those things and actually hunt for malicious activity. And we are seeing that the only logging that you can really get out of some of this stuff is performance related, not what it's actually doing. And this is something that, as we start to see more AI capable adversaries, we noted in the Global Threat Report, 89% increase in adversary use of AI. This is something that is going to be a huge problem, the next time we talk. And we're I think walking right back in. It's what's that saying that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think we're going that way with AI.
Yeah. On that note, it's been interesting. We all heard George Kurtz, our CEO, last week talk about just sort of our philosophy and our approach to securing AI in this era. And really, the insight there is we need to get as low on the stack as possible, literally to the point where we're working with the major chip suppliers. We want to secure data centers. We want to secure applications. We want to secure, instances of AI that's being deployed everywhere. So that's something that from a government perspective, that maybe is a good call to action. Because obviously there's imperative to leverage some of these tools. The world is moving on, and these will be used in enterprises, and there's been a lot of adoption there. If you're a government CISO and CIO, just balancing that with are you working with a vendor that appreciates the need to secure some of these things? Are they doing it in a way which is comprehensive? And have you set up guardrails so that as you're enabling your workforce to experiment with some of the tools, you're not creating an attack surface that adversaries are definitely going to leverage, because indeed we do see that out in the wild now.
Awesome. Rob, one final thought you'd like to share with the listeners as a takeaway from all of these upcoming changes?
Yeah, I'd like to just encourage everybody, when the national cyber strategy comes out, definitely give it a read. If you have a perspective on it, reach out to the National Cyber Director's Office. They have been really collaborative with people in the industry that have perspectives here. They do recognize that there's a need to cooperate. And if you're interested in talking more about any of these issues, how it might pertain to your department or your agency, whether that's at the federal level or state and local, reach out to us. We love to talk about this sort of thing. If you'd like to try and reach out to the White House, we find that they're out speaking at conferences. In fact, Director Karen Cross and some of his staff will be at our Falcon Gov conference here in Washington, D.C., 18 March 2026. So CrowdStrike.com will have various landing pages for it. Or find some of us on LinkedIn. We're all sharing registration links there. For us, look at our public policy resource hub at CrowdStrike. We have all of our requests for comment responses, where we're interacting with lawmakers and places like NIST that are accepting industry feedback. We write that stuff up. We put it online. We want to share it with everybody. We want to share our view of the best practices in the world. We also have some of our testimonies. Adam, some of the times that you've been up on the Hill, everything's recorded. It's all up there for people to breeze and look for public policy ideas. We have all sorts of other media and white papers and things as well. So check out the CrowdStrike Public Policy Resource Hub and reach out if you'd like.
I was going to say, and there's a fair amount there about cloud and data sovereignty and things like that as well. So really rich resources.
Rob, thank you so much for being a guest on today's episode. Really appreciate the insights. I think this is going to only evolve, and we'll have a lot more meat to get into as the year progresses. So I think this is a really great start into what's happening in the White House.
Thank you both for your time. I appreciate it.
You got it.
Keep doing great things.
And thank you everyone for listening to the Adversary Universe podcast. We will catch you on the next episode. Chat soon.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.